It's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Nathaniel Fick, who is a diplomat, a technology executive, a Marine, and author, whose career spanned battlefields, boardrooms, and embassies. From 2022 to 2025, Nate served as the inaugural U.S. Ambassador for Cyberspace and Digital Policy, where he led American diplomacy on cybersecurity, emerging technologies, and digital governance around the world. For that, Nate was CEO of Endgame, where he fostered a culture that led an exceptional team in technology, including many early advances in the field of AI for cybersecurity. He began his career as a Marine officer, infantry, and reconnaissance officer with combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, experiences that became the basis for his best-selling memoir, One Bullet Away, later adapted into an HBO television series. Nate's academic and civic credentials are also extensive. A graduate of Dartmouth, he earned high honors in classics and a national cycling championship. He then went on to receive both an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. He has since served as a trustee of Dartmouth, on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, and as an audit committee chair of Strategic Education, Inc. Nate has a strong record of leadership that infuses technology and policy innovation with uncommon humility and moral clarity. He brings a warmth and a humor that remind you that he has not outgrown his own humanity. On a personal note, once while CEO at Endgame, Phil will remember this, our team, unbeknownst to him, built a hilariously bad LSTM-based chatbot trained on his book and company meeting transcripts, which we demonstrated with high sampling temperature as a gag during a company hackathon. And Nate took that prank in stride and laughed with the rest of us. On another occasion at a company social, I watched as Nate quietly left the fraternity of socializing company directors and vice presidents to find a new shy teammate sitting alone. He pulled up a chair and welcomed her one-on-one, the new and I'm sure quite intimidated team member and the CEO having a chat. 8 years ago, Keegan and I had a half-baked idea for a machine learning and security conference that Nate, then CEO of Endgame, took a chance and funded, which became the first Camless 2017. So it feels an especially fitting stanza poetic refrain that he now provides our 2025 keynote address. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Nathaniel Fick.
Hiram, thank you. It really is gratifying. It's actually not gratifying to be back in Washington, but it's really gratifying to be a Camless and to see the community that you've created over the last 8 years. Congratulations. I know it's been a passion, it's been a lot of work, and how rewarding it must be to see this. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you. When Hiram and I were talking a couple months ago about the conference and about me coming to spend time this morning, I asked what he was trying to do. And he said the goal of the conference is to swirl the cultures of AI and security. That was your line. Swirl the cultures of AI and security. And so Hiram really gave me the 3 watchwords for what I want to say this morning: culture, AI, and security. And so my goal in the next half hour or so is just to talk a little bit about how these things came together at the national policy level, particularly during my time at the State Department, and how the technology connects to policy, how the companies connect to our national interest, and maybe a little bit about what's happening more broadly in the world and what we're likely to see in the quarters and the years ahead. So culture first, though, and with apologies to the folks I spent time with at breakfast, I warned you that I was going to repeat a couple things here. I'm a big fan of Peter Drucker's line that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what that really means, in my view, is if you have a great team with a great culture, but they're dealing with an imperfect market opportunity or trying to execute a subpar strategy, they will figure it out. They will adjust, they will learn, and they will ultimately win. If you have the perfect strategy, the perfect market opportunity, and it's being executed by a subpar team with an unhealthy culture, I would not give that team $1. So really, culture in my experience, eat strategy for breakfast. It's a flywheel. Compounding is one of the most powerful forces in our lives, not only economically, but more broadly. And cultures compound. Good gets better and bad gets worse. And so it's really incumbent, I think, upon all of us who are building teams and organizations to establish the right culture and then nurture it. Another point I made upstairs is this gets hard when you have people on the team who are both outstanding technical contributors, and that could be on an engineering team or a data science team or a product team. They could also be excellent contributors in a function like sales or marketing, but they're good at their jobs and they're terrible cultural influences. And what do you do then? In my view, it's actually quite clear cut. You cannot tolerate subpar cultural contributors, no matter how good they are at other technical functions. And this all gets kind of summed up in the idea that what most people are looking for in the workplace is mastery, the ability to get good at something and demonstrate that they're good at it. People want autonomy. They don't want their boss engaged in every little thing they're doing. And they want a sense of purpose. Why do we get out of bed in the morning? Why do we do what we do? So as we're building cultures, whether it's the culture at Camless or the culture in the businesses and other organizations that we're part of, I think you can start by thinking about how to give people mastery, the opportunity to develop mastery, give them enough autonomy to do their jobs, trust them to do it well, and then infuse a sense of purpose so that they know why it is that they come in the morning. Because in a knowledge economy, most of us are working in or building or leading elevator assets organizations where you've got some laptops and you've got some chairs, but basically everything you have that's valuable goes down the elevator at night and goes home. And so it's incumbent upon you to convince those people to come back up the elevator the next day. And a lot of that comes from culture. So culture is paramount, but you also have to have a strategy. And so I wanted to say a few words about the U.S. international strategy on cybersecurity and digital policy that I developed at the State Department several years ago that's still in effect. And if you read it, there are 5 foundational assumptions that are baked into it that never appear anywhere in the document. And so I wanted to walk through those quickly because I think they speak to a worldview. The first of those assumptions is that geopolitics in the world now in 2025 is back above the waterline. It's always been there, but we fooled ourselves or deluded ourselves into thinking that it didn't matter anymore for a long time. I came of age at a time when Tom Friedman had written a book called The World is Flat. Francis Fukuyama had a very popular academic theory about the end of history, but it turns out the world's not flat, and history did not end. And there's a broad-based competition underway right now between what I think we can loosely describe as democratic regimes, regimes that believe in participatory democracy, that believe in free markets, that believe, however imperfectly, in the equal treatment of all people, and a set of regimes that don't, that have a much more authoritarian, top-down, less inclusive worldview. And everything's on the line. The whole game is on the line. The big ideas of representative government, free markets, and representative participation by all people. The second foundational assumption built into our strategy is that tech is actually the primary battleground of that competition. And if you look at what's happening around the world, whether it's the importance of semiconductors in our Taiwan strategy, the importance of autonomous systems in Ukraine, the bio war that's quietly underway in agriculture, technology is the front line of this competition between very different worldviews. The third foundational assumption informing our strategy is that our adversaries are coordinating, communicating, and collaborating to a greater degree than was previously true. Look at North Korean soldiers fighting in Kursk. Look at the importance of Iranian drones in Ukraine. Look at China reconstituting the Russian defense industrial base, not with weapons, but with machine tools, with precursor chemicals for explosives. There's a coordination and a collaboration that's happening among our more authoritarian adversaries that's troubling. The fourth underlying assumption in this document is that the war in Ukraine has changed everything. So, particularly with our allies and partners, it's fundamentally changed how we should think about the role of autonomous systems on the battlefield. It's fundamentally changed doctrine, acquisitions, and expectations around the product development cycle for any technology that's going to be important to national security. If NATO gets anywhere close to increasing defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is the target, that's $3 or $4 trillion of new market creation, which is massive. There are very few opportunities in any of our professional lives where you see $3 or $4 trillion of net new market creation in one fell swoop. And then the fifth underlying assumption is that the landscape in the US is changing, but it's changing too slowly. And military doctrine's evolving, acquisition policy is evolving. More importantly, there's been a cultural shift, I think, in many ways in our technology sector. When I was at Endgame, Hiram, Phil, in the early days, that was still a time when Google engineers were quitting because Google worked with the US government. That's changed. We live in a world now where Palantir has a $400 billion market cap, Anduril's growing 100% a year, OpenAI and Anthropic and others are working hand in glove with the US government on infrastructure buildouts around the world. There's been a shift. It could shift back, but there's been a shift, and that's a shift that I think is positive in terms of helping ensure that the United States is equipped to perform in this competition. So those are all baked into this strategy. They don't actually appear anywhere in writing. The three pillars that appear in writing are, first, that we actually have to worry about the full infrastructure stack. The last time the US wrote a cybersecurity strategy was, believe it or not, in 2015. So almost 8 years went by between strategies, which is insane, given the pace of change in the world and in the technology during that time. But the last strategy focused almost entirely on sort of more traditional ideas, laptops and desktops and servers and mobile devices. And this strategy said, actually, we need to think about the interconnected nature of the whole digital infrastructure stack around the world, because risk federates across all these interconnected relationships. So our watch phrase was from cables to cloud. So undersea cables that carry 97% of global internet traffic, through data centers and the virtualization of everything, through telecom networks and satellites. But we had to think much more broadly. The second foundational pillar of the strategy was that we need capable partners, not just willing, but also capable partners. We pushed back hard on the notion of digital sovereignty and said that's a mirage by and large. And actually, we need to think about digital solidarity and linking arms more closely with countries, governments, people with whom we share values and history in order to ensure that we're aligned to confront challenges, that we're aligning regulatory policies so that our markets have, our companies have the access to the largest possible markets. And the essence of strategy is the allocation of finite resources against infinite demands. And so as you think about the very finite number of places in the world where the US can afford to spend cycles on partnerships, we need partners that are strategically important and where we can have an impact. I'll give you one quick example of how we did this. We developed something that we called Falcon, kind of a cute acronym: Foreign Assistance Leveraged for Cybersecurity Operational Needs. And this was to bridge a gap. So when the United States responds to a cyber attack on one of our allies, we send a hunt team to go comb through that ally's infrastructure to figure out what went wrong. And then generally, historically, we hand them a PowerPoint deck that tells them how they got owned. That's great, but it's not the full picture of what we ought to be doing. So we lashed up foreign assistance and capacity building to that hunt operation so that when the team left, they handed it off to a team that came in and said, okay, now we're gonna rebuild with you, and we're gonna make sure that you're better off going forward. The third pillar in this strategy was that we have to build internal capacity. It's like when you're on an airplane and the oxygen mask comes down, you put it on yourself first. And if we don't have a cadre of people in the government who can actually do our tech diplomacy around the world, then we're not going to be able to do good tech diplomacy. And when I got to state, it was still a culture where it was okay in a meeting for a very senior person to say, I don't really know anything about this tech stuff. My granddaughter showed me how to use my iPad, right? nobody would walk into a meeting at the State Department and say, I don't really know anything about this China stuff, or I don't really know anything about this human rights stuff. It's culturally not okay to say that, but it was culturally okay to say, I don't know anything about this tech stuff. And so we tried to change that. We changed it with internal training. We created a course at the Foreign Service Institute, somewhere out here in Arlington, with the goal of putting a trained cyber officer in every U.S. embassy around the world by the end of this year, a goal that the last administration and this administration together will hit. We changed the selection criteria for career ambassadors so that instead of just demonstrating financial judgment and the ability to build and lead an embassy team, they also had to demonstrate over the course of their careers a commitment, an understanding of the importance of these technology issues, and a commitment to advancing the tech agenda in their jobs. And so now, all of a sudden, that's one of the 6 or 7 criteria by which career ambassadors are selected, and it trickles down through the system and it realigns the incentives. We also created an award for excellence in tech diplomacy where we gave a $30,000 award, a lot of money, to people who had demonstrated, had done something great in tech diplomacy, and that's basically funded in perpetuity. So, you know, it really does come back to changing the culture in the organization and making sure that you have the capacity to go do the work in the world. So those were sort of the underlying foundations of this policy, but that's all pretty abstract. I think the way perhaps to make it real is to spin the globe and just take you to 5 or 6 places around the world and talk about what it looked like when we were out in the world doing it, and where the proverbial rubber hit the road, with bringing, in many cases, American companies to bear to do good things on behalf of our allies and our partners. So the first stop on this little world tour is Tirana, the capital of Albania. And in 2016, you got to bear with me here because it's kind of a tenuous set of connections. In 2016, the US pulled out of Iraq. And there was an Iranian dissident group that was operating in Iraq called the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK. And we needed a place, the US needed a place for this Iranian dissident group to go. And Albania raised their hand and said, we'll take them. One of the smallest, newest members of NATO, you know, more red-blooded in its support of the United States than most people in the United States. And so Iran took the MEK and they said, you can, or I'm sorry, Albania took the MEK and they said, you can be here, we'll give you a place to live, but you can't attack Tehran. And they said, okay, we promise, we're not going to attack Tehran. And a couple of years go by and they start launching massive cyber attacks on Iran. And so Iran responds by basically taking down all of Albania's government critical infrastructure in a massive cyber attack in July of 2022. And this was a problem because Albania is a member of NATO. And NATO has Article 5, which is the collective defense article, where an attack on one is an attack on all. So one of my first trips in the job, I got dispatched to Albania with our US ambassador to the UN in New York in order to send a signal to Iran that, hey, don't start a fight here inadvertently, because this is the sort of thing that can escalate actually quite quickly. And we got the hunt team in and they remediated the problems. And the lesson for me and for our burgeoning tech diplomacy team was the interconnectedness of things, of very different policy areas. You know, the decision about where to resettle a dissident group in 2016 led directly to one of the massive state-sponsored cyber attacks of 2022. And with tech interwoven into every aspect of our foreign policy, we need to think now about the technology ramifications of making these seemingly disconnected policy decisions. The second stop on this world tour is San Jose, Costa Rica, back here now in our own hemisphere. Costa Rica has no army. It's one of the only countries in the world without a military. Costa Rica is one of the only states in Latin America that recognizes Taiwan. And Costa Rica was in the process several years ago of upgrading its telecom infrastructure. So basically upgrading from 2G and 3G to 5G. And the big competitors to win the tenders were Ericsson from Sweden, Nokia from Finland, and Huawei from China. And I met with the president of Costa Rica and he said, What you need to understand, Nate, is the United States has one embassy here in Costa Rica, but the Chinese have two. They have their embassy, but they also have the Huawei office. And Huawei has been working around the world with the help of the Chinese government to get infrastructure deployed, everything from undersea cable to data centers to telecom networks. And they've been doing it with a very clear playbook of IP theft and then government subsidies of these big tenders. So Ericsson comes in and makes a bid, and I'm going to make up numbers here for this discussion, say $400 million for the 5G upgrade. And then Huawei comes in and says $50 million and we'll build you a soccer stadium. So, there's an asymmetry because they have the state behind them. So the president of Costa Rica and his team wanted to align themselves more closely with the United States. They didn't trust the Chinese infrastructure because the Chinese do have a national security law that compels Chinese companies, including Huawei, to turn over any data that may be running across those networks without any sort of disclosure. And they have to turn it over to the government at the whim of the government. So the Costa Ricans wanted to choose Ericsson and Nokia. And when they did that, when they announced their decision, they were the victims of a massive state-sponsored cyber attack attributed to China that took down hospitals, delayed surgeries, several people died. It was one of those cyber attacks that actually had kinetic effect in the real world. I went down with the National Security Advisor. The PRC government issued a press release accusing me with nice red and gold press release with the Great Hall of the People at the top, accusing me by name of spreading pura mentira, pure lies in the land of pura vida. It's hanging now above my bar at home. And but our goal was to stand next to our allies in Costa Rica and make clear that that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated, and it certainly wasn't going to be tolerated in the Western Hemisphere. So the lesson there was really the connection between digital infrastructure and cybersecurity. And something like a telecom tender can become the provocation for a major state-sanctioned cyber attack. Third stop on this tour is Beijing. I went to Beijing with Secretary Blinken in April of last year, and we sat down with the Chinese Foreign Ministry to talk about three topics. The first was their support, their work providing precursor chemicals for fentanyl and other synthetic opioids to groups in South America that were then shipping them into the United States. The response to our protest was to say that the drug problem in the US was our problem and that China doesn't have a drug problem. We then raised their support for the Russian defense industrial base and the fact that the Chinese are basically single-handedly reconstituting the Russian DIB and allowing them to continue their fight in Ukraine. And the response was that that was normal trade. And then the third thing we raised was Volt Typhoon, the attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure, pre-positioning attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure that could be activated in the event of a contingency in the world, sort of the digital equivalent of hanging dynamite beneath a bridge. And the answer there was just a naked denial, and that we were baiting and provoking them. I followed that up with a meeting in Geneva at the end of last year with our Chinese cyber counterparts, the first discussion between the U.S. and China on these topics in a decade, which gives you a sense of kind of how dysfunctional the relationship has become. And there was a Wall Street Journal article about the meeting that laid out some things that happened there. But it was the first time that really Volt Typhoon was linked by the Chinese to our Taiwan policy, which was interesting. So the idea that actually the prepositioning in civilian infrastructure in the United States was in fact connected to a strategic need on their part or an assessment on their part that they would want to disrupt us domestically and disrupt our power projection in the event of any sort of a contingency in Taiwan. And I think the lesson there was how much we've failed really over a period of 30 years to extend deterrence into the digital domain. and our adversaries and our competitors do things to us using digital means that they would never do using kinetic means. Because if the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese or the North Koreans or anyone is sending teams into the United States who are literally hanging dynamite or bombs from bridges, then we will escalate and respond. But if they do it digitally, we don't respond. We have failed to really extend all of our deterrent power into the digital world. And I think that's a huge opportunity for this administration now or some future administration to do. The old arguments for why you can't do it, I think, don't apply anymore. Over the last decade, attribution has migrated from being primarily a technical challenge to being primarily a political challenge, where technical attribution can be done faster and with higher fidelity than it could be done before, but still saying it publicly is very hard. So fourth on this stop on this tour is Kyiv in Ukraine. I made 3 trips last year into Ukraine. My office led our non-military tech support to Ukraine. That included cyber defense. It included Starlink, provision of Starlink and other satellite providers. Just incredible innovation in Ukraine, born of necessity. Eastern Ukraine is more and more the proving ground for these kind of conflict-defining technologies and also the foundry for how they're getting produced. And if you go to the factory floor where these drones are being manufactured, you'll see that the feedback loop from operators on the battlefield to people who are building is measured in hours and days, not quarters and years and decades. And it really is striking. So many of the young men are fighting in the East that the factories are largely older men, almost young boys and women who are lined up at tables with ring lights like jewelers, soldering and screwing together pieces as 3D printers in the background are just churning out componentry. They've figured out how to bring not only the tech to bear, but also change the doctrine of its employment and change their acquisition and their ability to buy these things quickly. So look, the lesson here is what's happening in Ukraine isn't going to stay in Ukraine. And we need that learning and we need it injected into our own system. We're not the best at everything. There's a hubris in the United States, and you see it in the US tech and defense communities, this sort of implicit, maybe never spoken assumption that we're better than everybody else, that we have more venture capital, we have more engineers, we've created more market value, and many of those metrics may be true. But the reality is that a lot of the stuff that we've been building and providing hasn't worked. It hasn't survived in a very high-end Russian electronic warfare environment in Eastern Ukraine. And so I think we have to approach everything that we're doing with a degree of humility. The fifth stop, and you see through these stops, the mandate for me was driven largely by what was happening in the world. It was a lot of cybersecurity, it was a lot of digital infrastructure. And then after November of 2022, with the release of ChatGPT, it was a lot of AI and a lot of particularly AI policy negotiation, both inside our government and with allies and partners around the world. I was in Spain when ChatGPT was released. I went back to my hotel room. I was there for a government meeting. I went back to my hotel room and I used it to prepare my talking points for my meetings the next day, just to see how good they were. And they were stunningly good. And I sent in a message back to the department right away saying, this is going to be really a game changer for us. And a few months later, the Brits hosted the first AI safety summit at Bletchley Park outside London, which is where the Enigma code was broken in World War II, kind of a fabled spot in cryptography and a really symbolic place to hold the meeting. And this prompted a lot of intense deliberations inside our government, not only about the models, but about every layer of the AI stack, about chips, about infrastructure, about the models themselves, and about all the applications. And the perspective that I tried to lend in these deliberations was one of kind of innovation, keep innovation as the North Star of our policy. And that really matters because, you know, exponentials catch us off guard. Like you can know that intellectually, but exponentials in life always catch us off guard because we're just not accustomed to growth and at that pace. And, you know, Anthropic is the fastest growing company in history. 10xing every year for 3 years with no sign of slowing down. Claude's writing 70% of its own code right now. We're probably moving to a world where maybe there are 3 to 5 serious frontier model efforts in the United States, maybe 1 or 2 in China. There might be another 1 or 2 that matter. I don't know. But AI increasingly is becoming an American revolution, I think. And I'll just go back to Anthropic. The founder of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, was living in Puglia in southern Italy when he started the company. By rights, that could have been a European company, but it's not. It was moved to California because his assessment was that the regulatory landscape in Europe was too difficult. And that's a problem for Europe. It's also a problem for us. So the American point of view had been innovation first, and that meant developing a set of voluntary commitments that the major AI businesses could subscribe to, again, voluntarily, because it doesn't constrain innovation. And the commitments fell into 3 categories around safety, security, and trust. The safety of what the models would return, the security of the models themselves, and then the trust by the user that they can distinguish between AI-generated and non-AI-generated content. I'll tell you, part of the problem in doing this work at a policy level in the US government is you've got to take abstractions and turn them into concrete examples that people can understand. And I was sitting in the White House and had to try to explain why this mattered. And the question was, well, like, who really cares? How is this changing our national security? And the best example I could come up with, I think, still holds true, which is imagine a data center with 100 million agents in it. And 10 million agents are building exploits, and 10 million agents are building bioweapons, and 10 million agents are doing intel correlation, and 10 million agents are fusing it all into grand strategy. And do you want that thing sitting, outside Moscow or in Beijing, or do you want that thing kind of working on behalf of a more democratic and representative approach to governance? And so that backfired a little bit because the knee-jerk reaction then inside the government was export controls. Well, how do we stop people from getting these capabilities? And I would argue that you can win one race by kneecapping your opponent. But if you're running a series of races, the only way to win is to run faster. And so ultimately, export controls are going to be doomed to fail. And the only way that we can win over time is to ensure that if you're a smart kid anywhere in the world, you want to build a business here. And that requires foundational R&D, that requires education from early childhood to post-grad. It requires the rule of law. It requires a robust financing environment, tax and regulatory policies that encourage business creation and growth, immigration policies that allow the United States to be kind of a mecca and magnet for talent around the world. And so the US and China are taking very different competitive approaches now on AI, and the asymmetry is actually quite striking. We're wagering hundreds of billions of dollars on compute, on hyperscale clusters, and ever larger language models in pursuit of AGI. The general Chinese approach has been embodied or embedded AI in industrial systems. And this kind of ensures the rapid diffusion and integration of AI across every industrial sector. So it leads us now into very different competitive positions where the US is continuously tempted to try to restrict the export of the most advanced GPUs, while Beijing is consolidating control over the inputs, particularly critical minerals. And all of which is to say, the competition is underway, and the competition unfolds across many fronts. It's unfolding across all digital infrastructure. It's unfolding across the cybersecurity of that digital infrastructure. It's unfolding across how AI is changing cybersecurity itself and also every element of that digital infrastructure. So I think I'm going to pause and make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a view of what the world looked like from the seat that I was in. And it drives home kind of the essential nature of what you're doing and the fact that the stakes are really high. the responsibility level is very high. And I think, in the spirit of only spending your time surfing big waves, don't waste your time on small waves. You're surfing a really big wave that shows no sign of breaking anytime soon. So thank you for having me, Hiram, the Camless team, and I welcome your questions. Nothing's off limits. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for the talk. So I've seen it postulated in people who are looking forward over the next 5 to 10 years and saying, okay, we think that there's going to be something close to a super intelligence, at some point fairly soon. And whether you think that's in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, then and when that happens, their assumption is the US government is going to look at that and go, if we don't nationalize this and control it, hackers from a state actor are going to come in, steal the good stuff, and take it back to their own country. And the military advantages that are inherent in having a superintelligence are so critical that we cannot allow that to happen. So we are going to have to do this nationalization. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm really fundamentally in my DNA a free markets guy. I also think that totally unfettered markets don't always function properly. I'm recency bias. I'm reading Andrew Ross Sorkin's book right now, 1929. Highly recommended. His new book about the crash. So I think there might be a third way there. I would be surprised if any U.S. administration had the popular support necessary to fully nationalize something like that. I would be surprised. I think I would also be surprised if it were left completely unfettered. And so the third way is some sort of a regulatory regime. And then the perennial debate in American politics is how much is enough? It's a Goldilocks question of how much financial regulation, how much cybersecurity regulation, how much car safety regulation, how much air safety regulation. And the answer is some. It's not none, but it's something short of nationalization. I think that's probably how this unfolds. But it's possible that there's something that's so radical that it's a discontinuity from the past. But as a good rule of thumb, I think the words "this time is different" are usually anytime somebody says "this time is different," I get skeptical.
Hello. Hi. Super awesome talk. My name is also Nathan.
Super awesome name.
Yeah. I had a question. You briefly touched on asymmetries, but with respect to both cybersecurity and AI, right, there are asymmetries that we do have to deal with. There's the criticism of the US as a culture of lawyers, China as a culture of engineers. And not just China, Russia, North Korea. I mean, if you're a bright technical person in North Korea, you will probably be coerced into working for their cyber force.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how it works in China. What else? When it comes to our beliefs in privacy and certain human rights, one could argue if you're trying to build super intelligence first, we can't collect data as freely as they can. Things like this. So we do have some disadvantages by virtue of our culture, by virtue of our governance structure. How do we deal with that?
Yeah. I think we actually have nothing but disadvantages in the short term. I would go so far as to say that, you're right. A culture of lawyers versus a culture of engineers means that, and this is true. Even make it domestic for a minute. Make it the asymmetry that exists between traditional attackers and defenders, where the defenders are Fortune 100 companies that are cultures of lawyers that have law and policy and regulation, and the attackers are unfettered. So these kinds of asymmetries provide, I think, short-term advantage. Well, so those asymmetries are intrinsic. Okay, they exist. And then you have an innovation. And most innovations in cybersecurity have been the war between, 8-foot walls and 10-foot ladders and 12-foot walls and 16-foot ladders. You end up with this kind of arms race dynamic of innovation and counter innovation by attackers and defenders, with the innovations usually led by the attackers. So I think in the short term, when you think about, and this is going to get into an area where you all have much more granular knowledge than I do, so I defer and would be interested in your point of view. AI-driven cybersecurity, applications of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, my intuition is it provides short-term advantages to attackers in hyper-personalized phishing, in exploit development, but it probably provides longer-term benefit to defenders in the ability to write better code. And more broadly, I think that there is enough vested interest broadly around the world, across governments, across economies, across societies. There's enough vested interest in kind of the digital world having a basically workable foundation of trust, because we rely on it for so much, education, communication, building livelihoods, whatever, that ultimately the defenders prevail, but there's a ton of short-term pain before, long-term stability in every innovative wave.
Thank you for your talk. I do want to return to your first two assumptions. The first one was there's kind of a dual paradigm politically in the world right now between liberal democracies and more authoritarian states. And the second one is we can't do this game alone anymore. We need allies. I'd like to get your read on where we currently stand as of today. The argument could be made we're in a much more murky position on both of those two things. On the first point, we've shown more authoritarian tendencies than we have previously in recent memory. And then on the second point, I think our leadership position has been, we've pushed away from it voluntarily in a lot of ways. And I'm curious how you think that could be seen generally and also in the area of cyber specifically.
Yeah. So look, I was fired by the American people in January. So I've not been in government for whatever, nine or 10 months. And I took that opportunity to go and travel around the world with my family, which afforded the opportunity to see the United States kind of from the outside for the better part of the year. And I visited with a lot of colleagues in a lot of places while we were gone, and heard some really chilling things. The head of intelligence in a big European NATO ally of ours said to me point blank, "We don't share intelligence with the United States anymore because we don't trust where it's going to go." That's kind of stunning. That is a stunning statement. And it almost doesn't matter what the reality is inside this administration, and I can't claim to know what it is, but that is the perception. And perception does, in fact, create its own reality. So I think it's really troubling. And I think that, leadership in an organization requires the consent of people. Like it doesn't matter what it says on your business card or where you sit in the org structure. You're only the leader if everybody else says you're the leader. And the minute they withdraw that consent, all you have is a title. You're not actually the leader anymore. And I think the same thing is true for countries. And the United States, since the end of World War II, had asserted this leadership position in the world that was born of economic strength and military strength, but it was actually born of much more than that. It came from a degree of moral strength. And it was a leadership position that wasn't asserted by strength. It was in many cases given, like by consent. And if that now starts to get withdrawn, then we're kind of back to the law of the jungle, which is a problem. So I don't know how it unfolds. I mean, this is in fact, the $100 trillion question is how does this unfold? Because I spent all of my comments talking about the United States as a unitary actor and how it operates in the world. The U.S. intelligence community would probably tell you, and I don't mean the political layer, but the deeper U.S. intelligence community has been assessing that the greatest threats to the United States right now are not external, they're internal. And they're not just political, they're things like a lack of shared identity, income inequality that reaches points that historically suggest, they can't continue. So any kind of strength in the world is built on a foundation of internal cohesion. And without that, nothing I said matters.
So you talked earlier about if you're running a single race, you could try to kneecap your opponent, and if you're running many races, that's probably not going to work very well. But if you're on the first or second of many races and you get kneecapped, that's probably not going to go well. And so maybe to your last question, what do we, the United States, need to do to avoid being kneecapped in this future you've been talking about?
Yeah.
Whether that's internally or externally.
Yeah. So,
I mean, maybe it's about rare earth metals, or maybe it's about income inequality.
Yep. I think that, it's funny, answering the question about rare earths is a lot easier than answering the question about income inequality, which is maybe part of the problem. I think that, look, the competitive playbook in technology and these critical inputs to our national security, I don't think the playbook is all that hard, or it's not that complicated. It's hard, but it's not complex. So our competitors are more or less running the same playbook across every one of these contested domains. And let's just take 5G as an example, because it's in the past, which means we can kind of analyze it. So in the 1990s, the US had a vibrant telecom sector. Bell Labs and Nextel and Motorola, and there was a vibrant telecom sector in the US, in addition to Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung. And then Huawei ran the table around the world over a 30-year, 25-year period, and they did it with a very concerted playbook of IP theft, state-sanctioned IP theft, in order to basically drive down the margins for the other competitors, which resulted in them having to gut their R&D budgets, which resulted in them giving up their technical lead over time. So IP theft plus Chinese government subsidies of deals, which results in that deal dynamic I described earlier of a $400 million bid and then a wildly, undercutting price bid with some goodies attached, like Belt and Road, initiatives like soccer stadiums and road projects and things, ports. And then there's a third leg, which is political intimidation, blackmail campaigns, and like really ugly stuff, compromises of government officials, and bribery, and honeypot sex scandals. All the most salacious stuff that you can imagine is actually happening, and is happening at scale across all of these telecom tenders around the world. And the result has been that that vibrant American telecom sector is completely gone, dead. Ericsson is kind of hanging on. Nokia is hanging on by one fingernail. And this really matters, by the way. You ask, why does it matter? Well, it matters because companies all over the world right now are trying to diversify their supply chains, because we spent 50 years building global supply chains optimized only for cost. And now a combination of geopolitics and a global pandemic drove home the point to everybody that maybe that wasn't the best idea. And that in fact, we should be building supply chains optimizing not only for cost, but also for security, trust, resilience, maybe human rights considerations, environmental, there can be a whole set of considerations. And so if you're diversifying your supply chain out of China, but you're putting it on Chinese infrastructure that can be turned off at will, or where your data is not actually secure, that creates a big problem. So that playbook of IP theft, subsidies, and intimidation is being run now across every other technology area. And so we have the benefit of knowing what's happening. We have the challenge of marshaling like a very noisy multi-stakeholder environment to do something about it. So I think that's what we do in order to ensure that we sustain our competitive advantage in these other areas. So, like, what does it mean pragmatically? It means, I would make sure, I think we need to make sure and are making sure that we have a robust, resilient biomanufacturing supply chain that is maybe not onshore, but it's friendly shored. That would be one. We should make sure that we have access to all of the inputs, rare earths and other things, and that should be friendly shored. There's a race to diversify high-end semiconductor production out of, a handful of TSMC fabs that are in Taiwan. That is a really high priority. But it also begs the harder question you asked about kind of internal cohesion. And I think that's what worries me is that we've lost the thread narratively and socially inside the United States. And so we're still pursuing all of these sort of technical solutions to technical problems around the world. But if we don't do it with some like unified, more inclusive sense of we, then I don't know what good it does ultimately.
Hello. All right. Thank you very much for the talk. You led with the Drucker quote about culture eats strategy for breakfast. And at a corporate level, you can pick your own culture effectively. You pick the people that work with you. And at a country level, you don't. You have the culture that you have built over time. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on how do we effectively influence that culture over time when one of the major social media networks is actually not directly under our control. It's under the control of a bloc that you would consider to be not necessarily working in our interests.
So I was a student. I had a professor in graduate school named Bob Putnam, who is a social scientist, and he wrote a great book called Bowling Alone. And his research was essentially about the erosion of social capital in American society over time. And the initial villain in the erosion of social capital was television, because all of a sudden, in small towns and urban neighborhoods in the evening, instead of people sitting on their porch talking to their neighbors, everybody's inside watching TV. So that's the world I grew up in the 1980s, 90s. But at least when we went to school the next day, people had been watching the same thing on TV. And so there was some shared experience in talking about, what you had been doing by yourself. Making content now completely on demand has atomized that. And social media and smartphones have taken it to kind of the nth degree. So I'm hopeful, and I say this as the parent of two teenagers, and they've really been on the front lines of this wreckage, right? I kind of feel like parents in the 40s and 50s, had lived in a world where their kids were smoking because it wasn't yet totally clear, or there wasn't yet any kind of collective will to do anything about that. And I feel like we're there with social media now, where the pendulum is going to swing back, and you see schools now banning phones, and you see countries, not the United States, but countries putting pretty onerous age restrictions on access to social media. And in my view, that's no different than saying you got to be 18 to smoke a cigarette. I think the brain science on that looks pretty clear. But an enormous amount of damage has already been done. And so there's this, kind of competition in American history that goes all the way back to the founding between liberty and community. And how do you strike the balance between acknowledging individual liberty and personal freedom as one of the kind of maybe the hallmark idea of the United States, but also if you fully atomize it and maximize for that everywhere and all the time, you actually end up with nothing. Because without a community, I've never seen a group of individuals that could do much. I've seen teams that can do anything. And so I feel like that's where we are. And, if we're all creatures of analogy, trying to find like mental models to make sense of things. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine and on Ukraine, and I think that there's no prospect of a political solution in Ukraine until both sides believe that negotiation and compromise are the better of their alternatives. And right now they are nowhere close. And I feel like the same thing is true in American politics. We only get some sort of a workable, compromise that recognizes the interests of everybody if the sides believe that that's in their best interest. And we're not there right now. And, I don't want to overdraw the comparison. I don't think that a civil war is a useful intellectual construct, but just in terms of the jousting, I think it's much more 1861 right now than it is 1865. Like, we're not at the point where people are ready. I don't see any sign that people are ready to turn the page and build back in some cohesive way. But I think like a precursor of doing that is going to be like reining in the excesses of smartphones, social media, mis and disinformation, in our domestic discourse, and the way that it's rewired kids in ways that I think the ramifications are going to be awful and long-term.
My name is Neha, so love that your name starts with an N. Not as cool as name, my bad, the other question asker. So you talked a lot, similarly to the last question asker, about how culture drives strategy and the need for digital solidarity over sovereignty. So in your opinion, how do we move from a culture of implicit trust between nations or partners to explicit, auditable trust frameworks that still enable cooperation?
Can you say a little more about that? I want to understand I think I've got where you're going, but
Yeah,
give me a little more context.
sure. So right now, I think I can speak more on the corporate side. There's oftentimes when you look at certain major players in the AI industry, you implicitly may trust them. Or when you're using an application like you talked about, like ChatGPT, you're like, oh, this is really cool. You may implicitly trust this particular application. But as we kind of learn more about, let's say, the ChatGPT example in our last keynote yesterday, there's actually a lot that could go wrong when using that. Or there could be maybe some sort of, maybe you didn't assume that a partnership would go a certain way in the case of major players in the industry. And so I'm wondering, in your opinion, when you're talking about digital solidarity over sovereignty, what does that look like to you as we're transitioning from, hey, I'm just going to trust ChatGPT, I'm going to trust this nation because they're NATO, I'm just going to trust so on and so forth, to something where you're actually being able to audit or understand or have evidence to say, oh, okay, I can use this application, or I can partner with this industry or company, or I can trust this nation to do this, build an AI factory and such.
Yeah.
Let me know if you want me to elaborate.
No, I think that's great. So I can't answer it in terms of auditable trust at the technical level and something like a model. But I think that if you're talking about nations, and I think this applies to companies too, the old Cold War adage of trust but verify is sort of the overarching view here. And the two kind of pillars of trust but verify are transparency and consistency. So you need transparency, you need visibility, right? It can't be trust me. It has to be reassure yourself. And then it can't just be, the peak that you're getting right now or the political leader you're dealing with right now, because anything complicated and meaningful takes time, and it's probably going to transcend individuals and roles. So transparency and consistency. And I think one of the hallmarks of American foreign policy since the end of World War II has been broad consistency on the things that matter. And now we're at a moment of massive discontinuity. And if that is and I think it's too soon to tell, actually. I'm withholding judgment on some things. But when historians look back on this period, is it going to be the beginning of a period of chaos and inconsistency where policy's changing, 90 degrees every 2 years or every 4 years because of political shifts in the United States? Or is it going to be one azimuth change and then consistency on a new track? And I think if there is consistency on a new track, even if it's in a different direction, the world will broadly learn how to adapt. But that same intelligence leader in Europe, who I referred to earlier, who said they're no longer sharing with the US, he said, and he said that they are actively decoupling from solidarity with us on some things, because in his view, why should he's speaking about his own country, why should our citizens have their future and livelihood decided by a few dozens of thousands of Americans in small towns that are swing districts in different parts of your electoral landscape? It's like, it's insane for us. We can't do that as political leaders. So, I think if you're talking about building in verifiable trust in a product, and you're talking about verifiable trust in national policy, it requires transparency and it requires consistency.
Hi, Nate. Thank you very much for speaking with us this morning. My name is Frank Sands, and I'm the Sands Capital here. So welcome
Frank.
to our office. Glad to have all of you here, and we're happy to be able to host this event. My question is, it's kind of a big picture question. An investment framework that we're working on, and I'd like to get your opinion on what you see going forward with this, is that we're in a national race, or we're in a race to win the AI race, and the nation or group of nations that wins the AI race can become the global hegemon. Okay, currently the US believes it is the global hegemon. China would like to be the global hegemon. Right now in the AI race, Jensen Huang in the most recent call with NVIDIA said that the US has currently about 60% of the world's GPU compute. We know the foundational models, you mentioned Anthropic, OpenAI, Gemini seem to be the three leading here in the US and seem to be the global leaders so far. And then, of course, the US has the deepest capital market in the world. And if anything, it's probably getting deeper relative to other nations as more comes back here to the US, which is very important if you're going to build data centers and power and all that kind of stuff. But a framework would be, are we in a race where around the world it's going to be, do you want to be on the US AI tech stack, or do you want to be on the China AI tech stack? And the China AI tech stack, maybe the chips aren't as good, the software is open source, but maybe it's 5 cents on the dollar.
Yep.
Are we going into that world, and is China going to roll out the same kind of plays they did in mobile telephony?
Yep. So yeah, Frank, thanks. It's good to see you. Thanks for hosting everyone in this awesome space. I think what you're asking is actually the key question of where does all this go? And my view is influenced by a lot of conversations over a long time with what I would call the global swing states. Like there's a set of countries that are generally going to be on the US side, no matter what. There's a set of countries that are generally going to be on the Chinese side, no matter what. So 2 points here. One, I think we need to be really careful not to create self-fulfilling prophecies. The beef isn't with China or the Chinese people. The beef needs to be with a cloistered Chinese Communist Party that is in control in a way that is repressive and authoritarian. And we need to allow, like in our own policy, and also maybe more importantly in our own minds, allow for there to be change in China from within. And we have to be able to adapt to that over time. But in the meantime, there are these global swing states, huge economies, huge populations that really don't want to be fully in one camp or the other. India, Brazil, Singapore, the list goes on. Most of sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of Southeast Asia, significant players in the Middle East, where it's simply not in their interests to be monogamous with either the US or China. And so we tried to calibrate a pretty nuanced strategy that sought not to force them to choose, but actually put the onus on us to provide a better choice. So can we provide a menu of options, policy options, business opportunities, infrastructure opportunities that that these middle ground swing states can affirmatively choose in ways that'll over time pull them more closely to us? Because if you pound the table and say my way or the highway in a lot of these geographies, you're not going to like the answer you get. And so it put the onus back on us to provide an affirmative choice. The G42, Microsoft G42 deal in the UAE, I would put in that category. I would put some of the infrastructure build out in Singapore in that category. I believe that one of the geopolitical missteps of the current administration was unwinding a lot of the good work President Trump did with India in his first term. And now they seem to be walking that back. But I think that taking too aggressive a stance with India does nothing except persuade the Indian government that they ought to be a little bit more diversified in their relationships, and ultimately that's not going to be good for us. So, I think the watchword here is, we are sellers, and like any seller, we have to be persuasive. We can't compel.
We're gonna have to call time. I am so grateful that Ambassador Nate Fick that you joined us today. I feel sufficiently swirled, don't you? So let's give our keynote speaker one more round of applause.
Thank you.